The 1AC has been sent. Can I get some sort of visual confirmation from all the judges and debaters when they're ready to go?
I think we're
I'm
okay.
good.
I have it. I just need to tell it. Give me 1 sec.
Okay. Just let me know when. Contention one is tobacco control. Spatially targeted advertising is the leading cause of death in systemically marginalized communities. What policy form can reduce disparity and harm? TI-15. Tobacco disparities are worsening. During marketing targeting media seems not a challenge. Policy change made an enormous difference. Must be continued to limit disparities. Smoking let illness top cause of death among Black Americans, Latinx Americans, American Indians, Alaskan Natives, Native Hawaiians, Pacific Islanders, Asian Americans, and non-cisgender northern people. Corporations will not self-police. These genocidal tactics. Restrictions are ethically necessary, even if they don't address root causes. Says Jacobson in Monster 18. Industry rarely self-police. As numerous studies confirm companies target people for the top killers. That's genocide. Considering the magnitude of human suffering, the chicken egg question is meaningless exercise. Neither case adds are fostering life-threatening addictions, even if merely reflecting existing conditions. They reinforce deadly trend. But policing people is counterproductive. The studies prove it increases use of PTF-20, TCA, FDA power, enforcing local sales, ballooned out or failure best to civil, not criminal, enforced by health personnel, no arrest, no confrontation, big tobacco pushing for ineffective methods take FDA out of local sales enforcement, and only magnifies endemic disparity and harm. ACLU at all 20 priorities and criminalization over harm reduction, investigate policing and interaction with law enforcement, federal criminal penalties, reintroduce war on drugs. As with federal prohibition, states will develop their own policies for harmful police practice. We can avoid repetition of policies. Only grant systemic criminalization. Medical consensus and empirical studies confirm our internal links and impact prevents the death of millions. As linked at all 15, evidence linking tobacco as adults and smoking, premature death, well established. Each link in the causal chain has been substantiated. Companies target youth exposure, causing smoking nearly all free use occurs by 18. High risk for long-term addiction because their brains are still developing. 5.6 million projected to die of smoking-related illness. Regulating adds a particularly effective legal phase. Legal obstacles first. The courts use the First Amendment to protect commercial speech. Second, preemption bans for power state and local regulation restrictions on ads could have resulted in a significant reduction in tobacco's use. We're refocusing policing on ads is vital to the success of tobacco control in the U.S. and globally. This Mackey all 14. TC expanded FDA authority regulate marketing implementation has been obstructed by legal challenges for broader strategy undermining global tech control central. Commercial speech versus FCC has been implemented through FCC without ratification. Will create obligations under CIA holding the requirements are unconstitutional, bringing user control back to square one. Successful defense against use-based litigation provide momentum for countries seeking to limit ads for undermine FCC implementation. They can enable future global challenges to challenge constitutional grounds. It's inevitable risk both domestic and global control efforts. 2 impacts for leading cause of painful early death. Mathematically outweighs any neg offense. Inflate both probability and magnitude. Offset both cognitive and epistemological bias. Chapman 7. That's the inevitable wipe out the 5 million die each year career with one phone. If that was by concern over low probability of death, severely rate and asterisks on cause of death tables. Research show catastrophic strike fear. Variation in the chronic dangers like smoking, media perpetuate myths promoted by industry and policy debates indifferent to mass death level of life expectancy, erodes quality of life, invisibility, but harder to believe. It's data if smokers underestimate the risk of potential premises consent is undermined. If the argument is accepted to allow industry to resist reforms litigation, ethics greatly complicated by rapid addiction, childhood notions voluntarily having capacity for voluntary activities impaired. It's how problematic the moral squalor. The case against control is compounded by decades of undermining every policy that might reduce harm. Second, environmental damage unique to tobacco or course at all 12 impacts of tobacco growing and erosion, destruction of water, species extinction requires pesticides and growth. Regulators increases soil fertility more rapidly. Companies try DDT ban related leading nearly all global deforestation. Tobacco offers no replenishment. Also occupies the best lands affect overall food security. The expensive food and livestock that cascades of planetary extinction. Chestnut 17. Tobacco growing, manufacturing, delivery. All severe environmental consequences including deforestation, fossil fuels, and waste. The scale of damage actually warrant now at stake is the entire planet. Contention 2 is commercial speech. Legal uncertainty generated by conflicting overbreadth precedents make advertising regulations vulnerable to commercial speech challenges. That's Basel Quad 12. For social intelligence, fourth prong, a fierce battle existed due to back and forth history. The legitimacy, reasonable pit remains questionable. Oral law to say starting over inclusivity to impermissible, really impairs the ability to regulate commercial harms. Forces legislation to catch-22, political suicide demands cigarettes to remain passive. Reasonable fit enhance ability to stop commercial harms. The court does not intervene. Split in the courts. The circus will continue to guard the men contract. Contradictory necessity. The Supreme Court must read from the reasonable fit test in the fourth prong. C. Politics, the corporate campaigns to monopolize wealth, media, and the levers of social change. As harms in calendar 91. Adds media interpersonal relations and identity key and socialization and reproduction more important affective behavior the verbal discourse. Budget goes to find pausing tool system failure to account for resistance or creative consumption to enhance life idealism, racist material determines prolific sense of function of ads crucial to diminish radicals and colonize folks to be able to will atomize publicly view spectacles of basic potential opposition felt indispensable in the maintenance of capitalist agenda, increasing powerful advertising, increasingly fragmented consumers lead to control the economy, media ads produce into personality structure, modifying refining social relationships, shape thought, and behavior should be more regulated. Ads for cigarettes, computer, First Amendment rights to advertise anything, anywhere, anytime to anybody. Discussion regulating ads is justified as saying to concerns with policy. Ad it's supposedly impossible to reform because reforms allegedly strengthen the system. It's a radical structural change is a long, difficult process. Neglect to reform ads strengthen capitalism, ads at the center of capitalism itself. It's try or die to repurpose criminal institutions in the near term, prevent structural and existential corporate violence from foreclosing the possibility of structural change. It's back in 20. Industry wielding influence to ensure business remain unimpeded. Data use to control how we act, think, and feel become impossible to regulate. If it's great government's capacity to deal with social and environmental issues of step and surging activists in the world have to be aware of attempts to co-opt the same allowing also lobbying to reduce government to expand markets, cut social division, shifting away from capital on the horizon. This time, we have to figure out how to rein in the doomsday machine, privatization, a regulation, not rules to control how another velvet glove hiding new love should be at the hands of the democratically accountable regulators. Do not advocate revolution. Existing structures, however corrupt, can be repurposed. Corporate pseudoscientific speech makes extinction inevitable by warping science and truth. Counter 17, out of control proliferation and WMD justify destroying Earth habitability, perils of a common root, the corruption of big science with big money, corporate domination of science, grown objective scientific diminished fund, climate denial results through fraudulent, untrustworthy, rational voices drowned out, anti-science, spreading of science, weakening regulation of activities to contaminate air, water, food, and medicines, and university labs, think tanks devoted to intellectual brothels in their quest for corporate funding, but also not lost. There is a way out of replacing the science for profit system. Human needs. It's not impossible. The survival of the human race depends on their success. Commercial speech makes all regulation and governance impossible. Worse than the Lochner era. This Edwards 14. Endless liquidation. Regulatory agencies are in violation. First Amendment is undercutting all. You cannot regulation. If you cannot regulate commercial speech, you cannot regulate commerce. Speaking implications, contraception, credit rating, fraudulently high industry sits. First Amendment, new options for undermining court regulation, data miners selling, pharmacy records, and target doctors, trading into suits first, advertising of industry close to body. First Amendment case law, establishing corporation. First Amendment feature society in a world of hurt, no corporate transparency, workers' rights, more to protect investors, believe your handcuffs after the court, granted commercial speech considerations, though justice recalling the Lochner era characters, but unchecked corporate power, untouchable monopolists, very few rights, rampant environmental degradation, extreme inequality, core structural outlawing, child labor, banning sweatshops, minimum wage, freedom of speech is being used the same way. Thus, the plan, the United States federal government should enact substantial criminal justice reform in the United States necessary in light of governing case law and criminally policing tobacco corporations and their advertising instead of people. Contention 3, solvency, police corporations, not people. Resisting industry attempts to co-opt critical framing of tobacco policy as a binary choice between criminalizing communities and total deregulation is key to ameliorate systemic inequality and harm without contributing to criminalization. That's daily on foot 17. Tobacco take advantage of the current racial political climate to discuss secret regulations to mean this criminalizing communities found its window of opportunity not to lobbying for thoughtful regulation, but further criminalization gets all regulations so they can continue marketing, exploiting distrusted police. It appears that there's no warning allowed to regulation to continue criminalization will lack of regulation perpetuate health disparities, although through ads. However, there's a third option. Carefully constructed policy places legal burden upon retailers rather than individuals. Policy because they're not extremely careful to structure regulations. They could cause unnecessary policing directions. Importantly, tobacco policies are written to avoid inequitable enforcement, sentencing, and incarceration. P policies proven to be advanced equity and concerned about criminalization. Why also not targeting ads. Substantial reforms to police ads were legislated in the Tobacco Control Act, but never enacted due to commercial overbreadth. At Silver and Fence and Hood 12, FDA ad restrictions never enacted. TC granted power to regulate, also banned all ads. The court in Lower Lloyd held too broad. Although substantial concluded challenge was unripe, although undoubtedly unconstitutional because not take effect. Congress and to FDA to modify the law in light of governing case law determination must wait until FDA regulation was issued. Fully enacting the TCA is essential to the effectiveness of all tobacco control efforts, and durability sets a pragmatic precedent for commercial overbreadth. As Sheckman 10, TCA adopts a ban on ads restricted on Lower Lloyd. FDA placed on hold that possible to make meaningful distinction. TC and Lower Lloyd. If TC's ad restrictions are unconstitutionally violate, the rest of the act will lose ability to prove public health and rating provisions are universally impotent. A catastrophic blood regulators must bear the burden. Courts requirement the government to expand the necessary resources necessary. Commercial speech is anything but settled in legitimacy. The TC rests in the courts. FDA burden the courts requirement the government must expand the resources necessary. Commercial speech is anything but settled in legitimacy. TC rests in the courts. FDA drive the maximum regulatory power. The result in interpretations untenable to the court reveal revert to deference and adopt the vice exception. Creation to stand unscathed. However, unlike essential unavoidable public health, thinking the balance of the impending decision, TC's provisions the most important without the incapable of regulating. Particularity should filter discussions to questions of veracity, desirability, and efficacy. Empirics prove the effectiveness of advocacy and representations in the context, even if no other. Waterstone 10, examining tobacco responses seem futility, radical pedagogy, just made evidence for aggressive changes possible. The economy essential for conducting common sense, critical geography, past judgments on policy goals, imagine a world with capitalism, patriarchy, all the rest do not exist, but who's listening? Left geographical voices is not enough to clearly know. If real events, quotidian, social circles, or grand circles, strategies, associations, and corporations become no part of the growth, then for critical geographies in the whole enterprises, brain craft, contextual, critical struggles, mobilized critiques are imminent. Common sense search by image, inverted division, alternative imaginary, interval, and powerful discourse, environmental protection, civil rights, undermining rationale use by tobacco, sort of unconditional rights, make it difficult for tobacco to challenge even in the face of seemingly unassailable hegemony discourse to be shifted through leaves that struggles, feet debilitated, the war possession tobacco is become global, taken of decades of voting burnout, reflects the effect that change should be listed. I'm good for cossack's.
Cool. So let's start on the Waterstone evidence. It talks about critical geographers never being listened to. Why?
The warrant it gives for why critical geographers should never listen to is because it's not particular. People make broad theories claiming the way the world operates without particularizing those to specific events. We've made a broad. We've made a
So
claim.
it's a
in one-
question of geographers just being like very broad then.
Yeah, the card says the economy is essential for constructing common sense. Critical geographers pass judgment on policy goals and imagine a specific world where the rest does not exist. But
Cool. Yeah,
it
I should
doesn't.
probably
It
move
ignores
on. Yeah,
countries.
I sort of get.
focus or-
Yeah, I sort of get the argument. The whole app is premised upon the sort of policing of ads writ large. What evidence do you have to say that ads themselves are the key internal link to people smoking or using tobacco?
Oh, we have a really good card on this question. It is the Lang evidence indicates that because teenagers their brains are still in development, that the existence of tobacco ads in public places like parks and within close proximity to schools drastically increases the chances that they become addicted to nicotine via smoking. The Lang evidence is really good on this question and says that there's like decades.
Right. Why
of
is that unique when other kids smoke? Like, I don't know how like influences of other peers, etc., like the way in which communities are organized, why are those not all causes to
Well,
ads?
the reason, okay, so like other kids get addicted for the same reasons. It's because of ads that portray tobacco as
Maybe in
not
like the
so bad.
1950s, but no one watches TV or looks at the
Well,
ads in
it's
parks. I
not
don't
like
know what the
literal
internal
ads. It's
link
like
is.
when they go to a convenience store and see ads outside the store advertising tobacco is something that's like,
Sure, I
tobacco
guess
is-
that's a debate to be had. The sort of modeling claim that you forward that changing the way in which we do it in the United States changes globally. I'm confused on how you reached that
Yeah,
predicament.
the Mackey evidence gives two warrants. The first is that it creates obligations under customary international law, whereas other countries, because they value customary international law, would implement similar requirements. The second is that
Wait, they
provides
they
momentum
value
for other
they
countries to
value
implement
the
ads.
customary law, therefore they just immediately adopt not
Well, there's
advertising
obligations under
tobacco.
customary international law that the U.S. is not fulfilling. Or modeling argument, the second internal link is more important about momentum for other countries. They'll see the U.S. to seek that as a justification.
Why
For
why are other
ads.
countries viewing the United States as like the background for tobacco? When has this ever been the case?
Well, the Mackey evidence makes a predictive claim. It's actually really good in this question. It says that
Right. What
because other
empirical
countries-
evidence that you have that countries are looking for that, or like looking for the United States to take like the first step in tobacco
The
specific?
Mackey evidence is hyper-specific to the Tobacco Control Act, which is the act that was never actually enacted because it was never enforced, and says that other countries want to implement that, but
What other
they
countries?
view the U.S. as a justification. We don't isolate specific countries that
You don't have
implement-
specific countries or specific evidence on certain
We do
empirical
have specific
forms,
evidence.
but
The
you
Mackey
just have
evidence,
this
the
vague
Mackey
law
evidence
that
doesn't make an
wasn't
empirical
implemented.
claim. It makes a claim about the Tobacco Control Act, which is the act that the plan enacts. This is hyper-specific evidence. This is not an empirical
Okay.
question.
I'm sending it. It's just one off, and then contention 1, contention 2, and then solvency. I'm not going to whatever the FYI page was. That was kind of weird. Let me know whenever it gets it.
Oh, oops.
Where's my stance? What the heck? Did everyone get the doc?
I got it.
Okay. I saw Larry.
I haven't gotten it yet.
Okay. Okay. Maggie, just let me know when you get it.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, cool. GBN, are y'all good? Great.
The affirmative isolation of public health is a just well-being and a tool for alleviating injury glosses over the structural systems that make certain bodies unhealthy. Health is then weaponized as a tool for corporeal practices that attempt to manage, criminalize, and exclude populations using the veil of an all-inclusive health policy. Maxwell and Kirkland 10 health is a return replete with value judgment hierarchies and assumptions that speak about power, privilege, health, society, and an ideological position when we shout down other people for not understanding healthcare. What we mean that is these people must be principally or politically misguided. Appealing to health is also we're all assumptions that are allowed to fly under the radar. The definition of our own health demands are in part to value judgment about others and calling it health construction bodies as desirable while brotherly others will see this. This result explicitly justifies particular corporeal types of practices while implicitly justifying that those who do not play suffer from ill health, calling the human system would mobilize a particular critique, but calling it health allows for race for a language that of betterment that skillfully glosses over the structural violence done to minority and lower income Americans, calling it health also enables structure and troubling slippages between the health of individual bodies and the health of economic ones in as much as the consumption of the health minority populations have not also produced poorly profits. So when you see social Darwinian screening devices that feign radical change through limiting ads, but massive line 9 to living in conditions socioeconomic conditions that makes it possible. This enables a cycle of addiction and recovery that makes black people debt-ridden off the levers of power, alliance, and 13. It is important to know that the masters who hold the wealth of power and would prefer that those movies accept their limited resources to purchase of consumer goods, health, disparities, perform two important functions that recycle resources back into the hands of the powerful, and they prefer their social Darwinian screening device that helps restrict access to the race of the powerful. Disparities they open up and have vast opportunities for rating consumers owned by the suppliers of addictive goods. They less helpful, healthful, and more stressful living and working conditions experience within the lower socioeconomic race. The demand for risky stressful living such as tobacco is not common for the same high stakes already refers to represent tobacco industries and medical institutions established to combat and treat the illness, disparities, restrict access, and privileges of power to so as to place those already in the lower strata yet have a further competitive advantage. Biodiversity represents the selective valuation of categorized life into valuable and less valuable. Their framework of biodiversity replicates a logical racial categorization that culminates in discrimination of extinction. The Bierman and Mansfield 14 extending biopaternal human non-human relations allows us to understand preservation as logic too is able to manage nature. The biodiversity consensus justifies the panopticist of global biodiversity conservation draws on colonialist discourse of mastery in nature. Non-humanist nature is packaging links and discrete species as designation that paves the way not only for conservation but also for commodification. It attempts to foster and improve human life based upon simultaneous depletion, extinction, and evaluation of living possibilities. The process of differentiation, race, and the break between that what must live and what must die, not only is race or fragmentation the biological, by drawing on ideas of evolution. Such fragmentation is about biologically improving life as a whole. Race and justifies the death function in the economy of biopower by appealing to the principle that the death of others makes one biologically struggle. The construction of race attention on a broad initiative of biological abnormality conceptualized as threat to the norm and conservation is biopolitical in that it shifts from controlling individuals to statistically managing populations and species. Climate change and environmental degradation is not caused by humans writ large, it's caused by the uneven development engendered by whiteness. The affirmative nationalist is coercive racial politics by universalizing its source and projecting its impacts far into the future. Winter 7, the attribution of non-national factors driving climate change to generic human activities in order to anthropocentric 14 with what is in effect this misattribution that determining the nature of the policy recommendations to deal with the already ongoing reality of climate change in order to be natural scientists. They are at the same time middle class Western subjects initiated by means of our overall present overall education system conflating their own existentially experienced referent we with the we of the horizon community, this then leading them to attribute the reality of behavioral activities that are genre specific to the West's man. The new ruling class generates prototype specific ensemble of new behavioral activities that were best to impel the industrial revolution as well. The second wave of experiential expression is based on the colonizing corporation of the large majority of the world's people all coercively homogenized through services over material telos and sensing climate change that overrepresented as that as the human with the well-being and common good of its referent we that not only of the transnational middle class, but also even more optimally of the corporal and multinational industries and financial networks, and indispensable to securing the Western portion consumption of the common good within the social and political components of the trust have been minimized, and nature is renationalized through the new unnatural histories presented the state, the truly terrifying nation. It's not that global warming climate change is irreversible, but that it might actually be reversible at the cost of radically changing the economic and social order. The spatialized violence of modernity displaces black diasporic geography, secures through the plantation economy. The 180s investment into the geography of whiteness honors the bifurcation segregation system of herbicide that underpins all racial sexual terror. Not like debate should have adopted an analytic frame of collective sense of place that doesn't calcify destruction of black sense of place for country. 11 transgender serial spreading on racial violence and targeted black bodies and profiting from erasing black sense of place. The plantation legalized black servitude while simultaneously sanctioning black places and these ways of understanding identify the racial underpinnings of modernity. History of black people's the unspoken labors of modernity, different social groups have distinct relationships to anyway differentiate move the plantation since that the stands at the center of modernity provide the blueprint for first futures just as a racial take negotiating uneven power geometry to white supremacy blending that to these ongoing geographies of differences precisely within our collective plantation features of black and non-black perspectives of place or debated our presence and repetitively constitutes likeness a discrete racial category that routinely triples in already settled whiteness. This protected normalized practices of colonization, land ownership, as identifiable seal locales of emancipation. Work it and emancipation. Their analysis of violence is flawed. Each moment of focus on flesh fosters linear progression to death and calcifies the racial code of otherness that outweighs every appeal to political imperatives, naturalizes the genocidal logic that likeness is always already dead and died, which destroys all forms of life. Kendrick 11. Post-law anti-black violence underpinned emancipation and intellectual work of honoring and racial narratives. The same struggles against us will be undermined by the same analytical framing of racial violence analyses that seek to document even when seeking to naturalize understand and serving the enemy to be present for their several constitutional frame to move forward. That urban second only descriptively replicate absolute racial violence practices, recognizing the potential degrading, therefore which justified without which is evidence of my plantation class found in narratives where particular communities are connected death over and over again, collective replication of profit from racial violence, overriding for racial destiny, a space of absolute others were grounded in linear biological narratives, the language of absolute racial violence, fall back in an activating frame of survival where the dying have always been the racial other because black death proceeds as necessary to the conceptual frame. Market that frame. Thus we endorse Jackie communism, a mode of organizing that centers the lumpen proletariat as an active leader in the process of revolt. Organizations as the young lords not only engage in the hostage-taking institutions such as hospitals have actively redispersed resources into community-led programs to solve drug use. O'Brien, 19, the young lords and BBB seeks the Lincoln Hospital Coalition of Black and Puerto Rican socialists saw revolutionary political education as essential to young lords to crack addiction, HIV and AIDS, and the growth of incarceration, recognize drug addiction, contributing to unraveling revolutionary organizing and insurgency to socialist parties that in a village towards the lumpen proletariat. If the dignity of workers is based on socialism, junkies have no place in the revolutionary project. The workers movement. So the poor as those outside the addiction was wreaking havoc on working class life. The trickles of these racialized forward because they are not separate from working class society. Black leaders were black workers were leading strikes. Sympathize with the rights and miseries of life under council to fracture the working class of working class society. Will require healing and building solidarity and love across its fractures. Market fractures. The permanent harm reduction, the context of big tobacco harm reduction, the institutionalization of activist strategies become taken with the state of social services to drain power from movements. The idea that the African worker tandem with the alternative is the exact reaction that big companies and the government have to mutual aid during the rage of HIV/AIDS. Myth 11. Harm reduction is a story of compromise and co-rotation on each historical relation with institutionalization. Harm reduction and reason is a little activity where activists risk arrest by distributing clean syringes to whose harm does harm reduction policy seek to mitigate and reduce that of the drug sufferers used for the social body politics contemporaneous to the institutional adoption of the biomedical disease model. Neoliberal health policy serve to demedicalize of addiction treatments to individualization as effectively same harm reduction. Oppositional political organs direction and restriction of politics which appeals to government to modify their behavior in favor of physical intervention against state power. Market as state power. Petition 1. There's no internal link to solving tobacco production overall. They don't solve routine users to introduce it to others and who still have addiction and transnational corporations who sell it worldwide. 2. Transnational nature ensure circumvention. EU proves Gallagher at all 20 years. Transnational tobacco companies' history of involvement in tobacco smuggling. The IGB requires that tobacco TTCs to be established independently. 17 months after TTC total code identified you and EXO as Philip Morris and claimed EXO was independently documented suggested TTCs and EXO continued to have a financial and operational relation to EU TT and TAT system appears to be inconsistent. Market inconsistent. 3. No threshold for the environment impacts. It's over 750,000 tons of cigarette butts per year. Habit is going on for decades. Truth Initiative 21. When e-cigarette and cigarette waste probably makes its way in the environment when it lands in polluted water, air, and land, with toxic chemicals, heavy metals, and residual nicotine, 571,000 metric tons of cigarette butts make it their way in the environment every year. Skip 4. This is the next advantage. 1. This is a joke. They have no reversal cause of evidence of getting rid of ads solves corporate speech. They have one piece of evidence of big tobacco influence some of it. 2. Corporate speech is inevitable. Their evidence at 1 AC Connor, 17B oil and coal fund and climate change denial, scientific farmers who the benefits and risks of the medicine itself, big food and illicit nutritional science and marketing tool for their products. They're also wrong. NYT and 17 tobacco companies will run commercials and ads with the unconventional unlikely to first. And more people will die from smoking every year than smoking than murder, AIDS, suicide, drug, car crashes, and alcohol combined. Market combined. The solvency page 1. Their solvency advocate says they need to get rid of regulation of mental health, not police acts. All assert their evidence.
Are you good for cross-6?
Yeah.
Cool. Status of the alt.
Arian.
My bad, I wasn't listening. You said status of the alt.
Yeah.
Status quo is always an option.
Okay. First, what is chunky communism?
Yeah. So the O'Brien evidence describes the use of like the past political parties or like revolutionary socialist tactics from the BPP and the young lords who utilize their ability to seize the means of production to sabotage hospitals and create communities wherein they could create like, modes of harm reduction that were outside of the state. We think that the way that this happens in the context of the AF would be that instead of criminalizing ads, the way the alternative would have a mode of organizing would be to create health programs intercommunally and solve addiction.
O'Brien says in the middle, the young lords understood that the chaos of drug addiction was wreaking havoc on working class life and sought a way to transforming addicts and revolutionary subjects. These struggles of the criminalized and racialized poor are particularly potent because they're not severed from the broader working class insurgency. How does the alt solve the criminalization of these groups?
It doesn't have to.
The alt is specific to the lumpen proletariat and the way in which they're formed in society. Rather, we've said that the lumpen proletariat is the most revolutionary class basis that we should use and mobilize.
We don't have to solve all instances of criminalization. We do have to solve the harm reduction stuff, and we do have to solve the links, but we think that we don't have to solve each instance of the way that
decades of
criminalized.
economic crisis, criminalization, and the collapse of the left that effectively severed the solidarity between wage workers and the lumpen proletariat with black and brown communities.
But yeah, we don't have to solve all criminalization. Like, I don't think the
How
app
do you
to
solve any
that.
criminalization?
Well, yeah, because it allows those within the junkie Communist Party to understand the relationship and forward an understanding of the lumpen proletariat and organize. So it organizes around those who are criminalized, i.e., the young lords and PPP organize around the lumpen proletariat or the black working class and utilize that. Like,
Okay.
it's not like they're criminalizing themselves. Like,
Okay,
what?
that's fine. Thank you. The McKittrick cards, how does the alt solve them?
Because it focuses their analytical frame on one of this lumpen proletariat rather than one of herbicide. The reason it solves the link argument for McKittrick, like the first card, is that it understands the relationship that the plantation economy and transatlantic slavery has to the way in which the lumpen proletariat is operationalized, and it organizes around that difference.
Okay. The social Darwinism link, how is this the AF?
So the Eliason evidence says that the way in which you've sort of understood the criminalization of big tobacco as a relationship between living conditions is a sort of misidentification. So we're sort of making a trade-off argument with this link argument that the idea that health disparities can be solved because we criminalize big tobacco does not understand the way in which the lumpen proletariat is, in particular, the relationship to the plantation economy precedes and is necessary to the conceptual frame in which health is to solve those harms.
10 minutes. Starting now. All right, 8:38. I will send it out now. Okay, it should be sent. The order is the tobacco control advantage, the commercial speech advantage, the solvency page, and then the K. Does anyone need that again?
I don't need the order again. I just need to download it.
Yep, all good.
Yeah, I'm good when you are.
Okay, can I get a thumbs up when other people are good?
I'm good.
Joseph, are you good? Smoking is the leading cause of early death among marginalized bodies. That's CI. Focusing police and ads instead of people seeking to prevent policing their criminalized black communities. That's ACLU. That always you should deflate their impact to counterculture and replace multiple biases perpetuated by corporate control of media. But we also await and deforestation and fossil fuel use that cause extinction. That's of course in Chestnut there. First argument, yes, internally TI and the other cards say that ads are the most of the most probable cause. Even if we don't solve for people in this instance, we solve for future smokers, which is still sufficient to solve. Now, this second argument they made, I'm going to answer it on the other flow because it has to deal with accessing all corporations, which they also made there. Now, the last argument, our evidence about specific impacts from growing tobacco, no warming defense is not responsive. Our impact claim is predicated off of deforestation, toxic pesticides, resource shortages, biodiversity, and other harmful practices unique to tobacco growing, not tobacco cigarette butts being thrown on the floor. U.S. deforestation alone versus extinct per bird to severe conditions of 90% of for essential health of planet, the lungs of the play better from cleaning air and moderating temperatures. Now even the sense of football feels a tremendous impact on the air. Now the commercial speech advantage, corporate pseudoscience causes extinction through climate vaccine denialism and war. That's Connor and Edwards. Only the F solves through resolution conflicting precedents and broader intervention. That's Pascala and Bacon. Their first two arguments, you can group them as well as this answers the argument on the other flow. Yes, we do spill over. Tobacco set the balancing test for all commercial speech. Overturning that precedent spills over to all corporations. That's Pascala and Harms. But even if we don't need to solve, our argument was just the checks on other corporations like movements can't succeed without the blends PD 18 to down, not the potential other waiting for us will be difficult to accomplish without controls on commercial speech. Now, and then the next argument, tobacco companies will still try to exploit any loopholes they have because they still have commercial speech protections, which means they're still protected, but they still have ads close to schools. And since younger kids' brains aren't developed as much, they don't necessarily recognize or can't analyze all of the risks that these ads talk about in the first place, which means that just as disclaimers don't necessarily apply to the younger group. Now, the solvency page, the last argument, the rehighlighting says we need to police sales laws and corporations, which is what the AF does through policing ads. Okay. Framework world about to decide the winner by comparing plan implementation to opportunity cost means are responsible for link uniqueness and solvency. First, predictability checks, infinite gross waste, food offense apps, recent analytical skills, second, burden of rejoinder defense calls relevance, pedagogy, and replication, and is only commercial means to determine winners. And that link turns the alt and of all of their McKittrick cards. Debating opportunity cost is good for black liberation, but doesn't link to offense about defending the state or the political diplomacy to the extent of the respondent to the agree with that. Call for that abolition of the state implemented forms of framing its justification of the same goal employed very on the journey of self-acceptance, existence, theory, and integrate safe spaces, respect, diverse spaces, unattainable, transformative, critic, finish, little more productive, to export traits and examine in individual relativity, actions, multiple stimuli with new ways to think, discuss black photo spaces, if you're not such spaces, also some the present learning cells, the collective progress, anxiety, operating the traditional benefits of institute policies that are very simple, change form, not quantity, and better health, and I act on a simple different approach, and a serious number than ethical type of approach. Now, first of all, allow them to potentially fit up and disagree, for sure, analyze the present concept of tactics necessary for the future of the black space, and it's specifically key to black geographic and the whatever revolutionary language thing they were using in practice to comparing solvencies key to orienting towards that tradition Spellstone, right? 19 explain the different select geographies are important for the black struggle, such as identifying different movements and vision, black geographies necessary. Impact of black struggle helps identify the direction struggle can take place geographies, different diagnosis of the nature of interplay symbols, different perceptions for leverage, and how that's my chief attention to conquer actions of agendas, my working to the effects of anti-flex and from struggles to solution theories, and analyzing black geographies must respect as distinct approaches and putting actions in the situation and material practices is necessary. Permutation, do both. Permutation, we do the after, you do the all. The first link, the public health link, it's co-opted by tobacco corporations because they use criticism of public health to sell more cigarettes, and links don't disprove cases for the 16 health securities aggregation more part than just product degree and so security can benefits in mallogical factor action doesn't the impetus behind the thesis of government self control security organizations to come to these practices makes it security more different but much and institute not global implications these dangerous of notice only what is maybe to increase political interest and policy attention through security somewhat will not fit for it's a two-way street because it causes public health to inform security, and conditionality is bad because straight terms are good, punishes bad when it sees words more 2 ECs, which causes increased research for deterrence. Dispo solves. Now the next link, it's a link of omission. The plan can solve through policing ads, and this is our argument. Tobacco corporations co-opt any movements against them. Only directly confronting the ads and policing themselves can solve. But the card that I read in the other link also applies to this card. Now the winter link, our impact was not climate change in the abstract, rather environmental impacts caused by tobacco growing. We never said that those weren't white people. In fact, it definitely is. But only the Af can solve it through materially confronting those the commercial speech protections that are upholding the tobacco corporations in the first place. Now, this herbicide McKittrick link, one, the link is non-unique, and we solve it by criticizing tobacco corporations and contextualizing their struggles to protect their demands. We're able to undermine the discursive hegemony of tobacco and reduce causes of violence. Tobacco corporations are herbicidal and creating systemically negative effects on black health that make black community building harder. This Waterston 2, the card is a double turn, saying the plantation stands at the center of modernity. Also displaces black diasporic geography. So different diaspora can no longer assume shared difference between African Americans, black Americans, and the person standing for no longer taking Americans don't experience or respond in the same measure. Identity or affiliation experts, but to assemble the black social order of black for African than did during the slave to African diaspora as a correct black definitely limited by experiential properties for African Americans on the context their increasing constitution of African Americans laws that involving black immigrants on the to which historical diaspora demands are reclaiming the frameworks of blackness. The second McKittrick card, one, will impact on the thesis. Concretizing anti-black violence is good because it's the only way to address it. That's access 7 people care about how injustice can be corrected, and just always specific concrete defense of recognizable types can be corrected, but punishing those responsible to those specific cases institutions social institutions and injustice cannot be answered application to theory concrete situation models based on assumptions the right words transform reality or agreement automatic results in action justify the adoption and significant within injustice and real situation critiques right with different cannot be exempted to change by themselves for little bit the result came into special consideration specific right can be changed but shifts in existing interest real people. So two, specifically true for public health impacts. As McLaren says, there's no inherent incompatibility between the methods and critical increased data and method of real inequity sensitive factors of written perfection and present practice and ensure they adequately reference and context. Do not this to exclude numbers and numbers can be powerful to prompt exclusion to back studies tests and definitions to the factors cross settings that are time identify gaps and implicit assumptions indications from the face logical government interventions demonstrable benefits for health equity. Now the all gets co-opted. The first criminalization dissent to the card says that criminalization is why worker solidarity is fractured. Creating the local communities doesn't stop the police from criminalizing people due to drug addiction and proves the perm is sufficient to solve because we stop the criminalization of people and instead we focus on corporations. And the alt co-opted by tobacco marketing, which positions smoking as a language of rebellion. This form of corporate biopower is worse because the scripts of boundaries of acceptable resistance while retaining the illusion of radicality. That's Holmes and Poland 15 to some smokers could be defined for tobacco control industry activism markets the right to construction becomes industry shifted to symptoms within celebrating some smokers that's cool in the marginal day-to-day interest on healthy practices within the own that we have that within context where we need to provide the friends context of as possible and context whatsoever for the health imperatives of resistance therefore suspicious and inherently empowered nature of resistance really about people such as resistance not the hinge that sparkness with tobacco industry produce smokers the victims of and in the state backlash is an how we reflects public health can deal with resistance and the state is inevitable. That's true. 16 some and etiquette for protecting any engagement with the whether we voting different forming parties attempt the government based such an engagement million getting of hierarchies abstention and some different municipal government and powers then the same when we refuse to engage making demands don't necessarily entail endorsement on any more than demands making by employees during a strike. Okay, so mark that show evidence at employees during a strike. Do you want a mark copy? That's the only card I marked.
Yeah, can you send that?
Yeah.
I'll just start when we get it.
Okay. I sent it. It's just that last piece of evidence, but.
Okay, we got it. I'll just start because I need to ask one question. What were the net benefits on framework?
The net, like our standards?
Yeah.
First one was predictability, checks
Okay.
infinite regress, race could have offense, steps research and
What's the
analytical
second one?
skills. Burden of rejoinder.
Okay.
I can say the rest of the standard if you
No,
want.
no, I'm good. I think I get it.
Wait, can we get the exact text of your interp actually, like for framework?
Sure. Do you want me to say it or like send
The
it?
exact interp or like send it. I don't know. Like. Okay.
Okay, I sent it.
Cool. So the sort of stuff about like the alt getting co-opted by tobacco, I guess I'm sort of wondering why, if like, what is the warrant for like your card is like big tobacco advertises smoking as cool. Why does that like mean the alt just promotes smoking?
Yeah, so the Holmes and Poland evidence, as well as the De Leon and Bacan evidence from the 1AC, kind of talks about this. It talks about how like radical anti-state social movements that are kind of marketed as the like new, I guess, next best thing is the way you could categorize it.
Yeah,
Is
wait, okay, so we have said that like the alt prioritizes stopping addiction because it prioritizes literally taking over hospitals. Why does that mean that the alt like is like promoting smoking as cool and revolutionary?
Yeah. So we'll argue that without like imposing those restrictions on commercial speech or regulating tobacco ads, tobacco companies use that kind of language to exploit it and make tobacco seem desirable, make it seem like better than it actually is, which causes like
Okay.
people with
I want to ask a really quick question about framework. You said we're responsible for link uniqueness and alt solvency. Do we have to win both, or can we just win link uniqueness or alt solvency?
probably I
mean, if
guess
the
you have
links-
to prove that the plan is worse than the status quo.
Okay, so if the link is unique and proves the plan is worse than the status quo, then can we win?
Yeah, that's probably
Okay,
fine.
cool. The stuff about like policing ad solve on the solvency page, I'm wondering where this card says this. Like you very creatively highlighted this last line, or actually it's 2 lines completely separate from each other. Where does it say, or like from the De Leon food evidence, where does it say that like targeting ads, like you've said like if you're concerned about criminalization, why not also target ads? But those are like 3 different lines. Where does this like conclude your way?
Okay, so it says, here, let me find it. Yeah. So there's a third option, a carefully constructed policy that specifically places a legal burden upon retailers rather than consumers. That was one sentence. It says that if policymakers are not extremely careful to structure, yeah, it says, I'd point you
Yeah,
to
that is what we have re-highlighted. If policymakers are not extremely careful to structure menthol regulations and sales laws.
Yeah.
How is the
so
AF menthol
it's
regulations?
menthol regulations as sales laws. Those sales
What?
laws
You
definitely
don't influence sales.
sales
You influence
sales
ads.
are directly connected to sales. Ads are how you
What?
get sales. Like
I
if you don't have ads to advertise your products,
I do not think that's what your card is talking about, but sure. 10 minutes.
Stop prep 625.
Order is going to be just the K. I'd flow straight down. I guess I'll delineate what the 1 NR is going to take while I'm giving the 2 NC. Couple of cards, I'll send them out. Sorry, I don't have the analytic macro, so I have to actually go through and take everything out. It's a couple of cards, so I'll just send it in a doc to make it easier. Okay. Just send it out. Tell me when everyone gets it. Did everyone get it? Cool. If no one stops me, I'll just start in the next 5 seconds. Considered theory of anti-black geopolitics, this is based civil society's history is sustained through practice of geospatial domination of black sense of place. This originates from the plantation economy, the structure that initialized the process of black annihilation in the United States related to space. Reforms of racial violence reify racial colonial categories. Racial geographies are mapped by carcerality. In the name of white saviorism means 2 things. First, it reforms are sutured in spatial expansion. White carcerality explains itself on a black body through politics of ethics, preserving the condition of captivity temporalizes the deviancy. That's foundational to society. We haven't made a prescriptive argument about how all politics are bad just there before being bad. That'll be on the link debate. Second, this geospatialization infiltrates the evaluative paradigms for all of you on the judge as the judges. Cultivating black sense of place means acknowledging all the ways in which you're indebted to black people in this space, like innovation from people like Asia and Amber and DSRB. And the topic written by Colton, it's not about absolving yourself, but sacrificing your right to have an opinion on what's best for black people in the wake of anti-blackness and forefronting McKittricks. Now, the framework for counter interpretation of the role of the to determine the way in which we relate to space and refuse the mere sustenance of democratic imagination. This is a sickly process terminally exhausting for black people and reproduces visible death as a tool for political agenda reform in favor of black spatial temporal nihilism that puts aside the dogmatic preconditions and proceduralism in favor of creating energy and tools to survive the abyss. We're in 21. Democracy is a speculative impact that drains the imagination, vital resource of its own survival, speculation, outrage, expenditure of energy, and requiring the useless political repetition. Repetition is most dramatically demonstrated in the black political participation. Alberta Hope in the ontology of change and the chance of yes, we can neglect the failure of black political participation. The blacks did not vote when the police shot Tamir Rice, when Blaise Blood lost her life in the police custody after police deprived Eric Garner and George Floyd of breath. Such inquiries are unanswerable within the creative democratic horizon. Black nihilism would suggest that time is not a natural right, time is a racial privilege that embeds itself itself within being their enterprise, such as black politics, reproduce itself as the same that introduces the break-in. Violence and spatial temporalism is a precondition for being an ethics and police shooting of COVID-19 deaths and foregrounds of failure to alleviate black suffering. Black political optimists consider black pain as a form of political possibility. Black response to black existence needs imagination liberated from formal thought. Dogmatic precondition focus on black imagination and black amidst such investment is all that we have. They say predictability, but first is unpredictability good? Black existence sutured to temporal slavery. Non-predictability forces civil society to recognize a fraction of black suffering. And second is forwarding predictability is intrinsic good is the slave master's move towards it. It allows for the judge to fulfill their desire by saying that making the game more predictable is a prerequisite for your discussion. Upholding debate is white fantasy space. Third is the anti-blackness is the key generic in the AFSCU topic means that it's infinitely predictable. Clash. First, it's geopolitical clash by efficient deliberation over domination maximizes the killing of black bodies, commodifies blackness. Second, not everyone's here to be a policymaker means you should prioritize subject for oriented clash, as it's the only thing that make it change Rutgers that we can LRC prove. Third, his quote of the topic is reform versus radical approaches. They should be able to defend their approach to civil study. Also, weighing the app as the intellectual strategy solves. Fifth, his app choice solves. They just chose the app, so they should be able to defend it in the first place. The sort of opportunity cost stuff. First, they haven't answered the sort of question of access that we pose. People within the illicit economy, i.e., drug addicts, the criminals, prisoners, and the sex workers, all don't have access intrinsically to this cost-benefit analysis that they've isolated is necessarily good. Takes out that, but second, the sort of linkage that they've isolated does not work insofar as if it over and under sort of utilizes the sort of frame of materialization. We've critiqued that as a notion on the urbanist side stuff, and the other McKittrick card that they didn't answer, which I'll do below. Also, it's a question of tactics in this space and political revolution. If you can prove the research method of the modernity is good, then you should vote for us. They say that black geography is praxis stuff, but it's comparing black geographies. They have no internal link to it because black geographies is a critical space for academics to sort of pursue their rights against the state. This is not the app because they really forward themselves towards that political praxis in the first place. Second is the analysis is corrupted by their sort of proceduralism that is enforced at the top of framework. The permutation will be done in the one on the link stuff. It'll be done in the one on our the YouTube debate. Framing issue counter metric and black spatiality. First, non-black death isn't an impact. If we win, it's reliance on eradication of black life. There's no ethical reason why the judge should care about the violent destruction of anti-black masters. There's will to anti-black. Second, the herbicide. Just the ass focus on the catastrophic spectacles like extinction naturalizes the specialized violence that occurs in more subversive geographies. This process of herbicide renders anti-black violence to dispossessed black bodies unintelligible, which means that A, you sacrifice everything to prevent the destruction of dispossessed, and B, the constitutes cyclic violence that is proven by examples like practices like redlining, carcerality, and labor that are considered spatially productive. Third, his utility is caught within the mathematics of blackness. Dropped argument coming out of the one and C told them to the magnitude-based decisions contribute to the archive of narratives and data repeat gratuitous fonts equates the blackness to the valueless and always already dead, forcing it to operate in a metaphysical register outside of Utah, which A asserts hegemonic control of black bodies, proven by historical examples like the Scramble for Africa, but B creates a paradigm that refuses registering anti-black violence in the first place. Fourth is sequencing preserve black sociality and then analyzes consequences, solves for all of their offense with a net benefit of saving black people. First, they say I'll start with Condo is good. First is innovation debaters are risk averse, having fallback strategies that allows for breaking new arguments. Second is Netflix. The app gets a focus of the debate. Condo allows us to compensate for reactionary ground. Third is info processing multiple options, forces the to see efficiency best answered as a cause of critical thinking. Their standards, the straight search stuff, it doesn't make sense when we've only read one conditional advocacy. The strat skew stuff, you just have to answer the link anyway, which means it would have been the same 2 regardless. This doesn't solve because it doesn't allow us to kick the all of the instances that they've isolated. The total refusal of public health services. We've critiqued that notion because we've said that refusal is necessarily good. And this sort of confronting of ads is key stuff. Top level framing, the app does not say the solvency advocate for the app or other metrics for the app don't make an argument about ads being necessarily key, but decrim writ large being key, which is that internal solvency deficit to all of their offense. If the app can sort of draw internal link between the taking out of ads and those populations specifically not being tailored to that specific form, that they don't solve anything and only any harms of the app in the abstract. These sort of herbicide stuff, I'll do it here. The app is key. No, it's not. It's a critique of spectacularization of violence that the app is engaged in because it says that minorities are suffering from tobacco right now. It displaces the sort of assumption and the way in which the unspectacularized violence and the disposition of blackness occurs. The sort of Chauvet evidence about the double turn. It's not saying the plantation economy is the central focus point, but rather it says it creates a sort of way in which the United States sees that dispossession happening in the first place. It's not a global paradigm, but an understanding of the way in which we relate to space and re-highlighting the Mitch Kittrick card. I don't know what this gets them because it doesn't make a real argument. The re-highlighting does not refute any reason why we've said herbicide is necessarily bad. If anything, it just provides uniqueness for our argument. The thesis stuff, Zach is not an impact turn to the thesis. You can't give them this because it just says that the politics is malleable. That was done in the overview that says that politics can be valuable, but it's a question of what you've done in this specific round and what the app advocates for. The materialism stuff first. If the app is hypothetical action forwarded by imaginary, that doesn't have a good defense, which begs the question of why people who read USFG action always get to imagine smooth implementation via durable fiat, but then they'll expect us to have every small detail smoothed out, or it's a reason why the alt is bad. It creates such a double standard that creates violent exhaustion, pushes queer activists out of the space. Second is if black people are on board with the plan, will be circumvented. Studies show that black people who support policy will be less likely to pass Stephanopoulos 15. Black political cloud is deceiving, and recent study of federal policy has no white support. It has a 10% chance, while the universal white support has 60%, but no black support has only 30%. Has support of policies rising in the black community. The odds of achieving the actual decline. Third is cross-applying the herbicide framing, emphasis on material strategies that has only solves visual violence without understanding the other violence. Fourth is cultivating black sense of place means creating pockets of resistance for minorities within black communities like queers, women, and debilitated folk. Only we access that junky communism stuff. The stuff I did above answers this sort of the co-option argument, but I'll extend the alternative explicitly here. The alternative is junky communism. Lumpen proletariat exists at the dishonor of society that they rendered proximate to violence because their labor is seen without dignity. Lumpen proletariat are the black imprisoned, drug addict, homeless who should be centered in our politics, especially in the context of addiction. O'Brien explains that junky communism refuses the institutional frame of harm reduction that attempts to move the lumpen proletariat closer to normalcy, but sabotages the institutions necessary for the one who sees to simultaneously create health organizations that the Young Lords and Black Panther Party all prove ways in which we can take over hospitals and reallocate resources. Ready.
Okay, we're gonna take a little bit of prep before cross-ex. 8:38, starting now.
Sorry, I think we still prep, right? Or oh wait, y'all starting prep.
Okay, 7:07. Let me write that down. Can also send it in the chat. All right, are you good?
Yeah.
Okay. I want to start on framework. Can you kind of just like walk me through how your interpretation functions?
Says that spatiality and the way in which we relate to certain spaces, discursive practices come as a prerequisite to anything else. The Warren evidence isolates how political repetition operates and how it sort of is somewhat exhausting for Black people. It also isolates that creating a sort of strategy in existing in the abyss for Black people is a necessary prerequisite to any other politics because it doesn't assume the sort of access question that we've asked.
Okay, that makes sense. How does the judge determine how we relate to politics?
That was the sort of like judge framing argument up top. The judges shouldn't have the ability as non-Black people to delineate what is and what isn't good for Black people. Rather, they should focus on what the Black academics in the space are saying, like McKittrick, etc.
So, which Black academic should we listen to? Because we've read some
McKittrick.
too.
Like it's a question of how we've operationalized these forces. We've said that the way in which certain bodies are inherently dispossessed is
Yeah.
the framework that you sort of assume. So you assume Black minorities within academic spaces as a prerequisite to your organization.
Sure. I guess I'm just kind of confused. Like, say we have two Black academics who are advocating for different things. How do we evaluate which one we should listen to?
You said there's a difference between just Black academics writ large, but Black minority academics, i.e.
Okay,
Black
so
women, Black
two
quars.
Black minority academics who advocate for different things. How do we determine like which one to listen
Again,
to?
it's a question of delineating between those terms. It says that the way in which we understand critical cartography comes first.
The way
Like we've made an argument as a
if the way in which we understand, we just have to defer to Black people. How do we determine?
It's
who
not
we should defer
deferring to Black
Like,
people, but it's refusing to have an opinion on things that we can't initially say.
well, yes, I understand that. I'm just confused. Like, if they're like, the default evidence is a Black woman solvency advocate. She thinks the plan is a good idea. Like, why should we prefer the plan, or why should we prefer your evidence as opposed to ours?
Because
Like,
we've
how do you
said that
determine-
dispossession is a prerequisite question. This sort of framing mechanism is built upon the understanding of how Black bodies are inherently dispossessed from space. Only McKittrick can analyze that sort of analysis, which means that unless you have McKittrick evidence, it doesn't understand the framing mechanism that we
Okay, so the framework interp is listen to McKittrick.
we were talking about the judge orientation question. The framework
Sure.
stuff is about spatiality.
Okay. The alt, I'm kind of confused. How do you get around the sort of co-option thing?
Because we said the question of materiality should come before, i.e., first we made an argument about how there's one-to-one correlations with how policy people get to advocate for solvency and how K people get to advocate for solvency. But we said the co-option stuff doesn't happen insofar as it allows for the lumpen proletariat to organize within resistance spaces.
Okay, that's time.
Okay. There's no cards. Actually, there's gonna be one card, but it was just a card that Arian didn't get to in the 2NC. And then, I'm gonna actually finish some 1NC cards, but they're all in the 1NC doc. So unless someone wants me to send those out, then there's no cards. Like, if anyone has an objection to that, please tell me, and I will just send them out. But
I assume you'll just signpost when you switch between docs.
yeah, I'll just say like I'm finishing this card here. Sorry, my bad. I forgot to give an order. It's the K. I'm doing like the bottom alt stuff, and then like the perm / link thing, then the first advantage, second advantage, solvency. Actually, my bad. Sorry, I'm starting with the perm, and then I'm doing perm links, then alt. My bad. But everything else is the same. Okay. My dog's not. Okay. Maggie, are you there actually? Hello.
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
I think I might have to keep my camera off for the rest of the round because I have limited bandwidth, but I'm
Okay.
here.
Yeah, no problem. I'm just wondering if you're there. Okay. You all good? Great.
Permutation 1, framing issue, authorization based on one is part of an arc redemption that legitimizes white power by moving their geography onto the plantation economy, which remaps the 180 from the hierarchy to every link is a scholarship decided to the perms of solvency. A is the alleviating injury link. The Metzel and Kirkin evidence says that 180's policing of tobacco ads is based in the discourse of health and wellness, which constructs certain bodies as desirable while relegating others of the scene. Lives like, quote, within this landmark global health governance initiatives are part of a number of mechanisms focused on both the demand and supply reduction in response to the globalization of the tobacco epidemic and the 180 Waterstone evidence, and, quote, community concerned about health problems can reach against other low probability threats is the public health risks that we're critiquing. The 180 Chapman evidence cements the absent investment in the fantasy of public health that relies on the template of power and privilege that leads Black people as growth pathologies and devaluing flesh, which understands public health risks as some as naturalized and dead, of some as health, which links to all the urban side bad framing that oriented in the tyranny, which is no different than when people like Dylan Allen, who was a Black queer, had his body delineated from as a tool of bioterror by prosecutors because he spit on a cop and while having HIV/AIDS, or the song when Black people were thrown into the Atlantic because they didn't have value, which has the external impact of herbicide. All of our framing arguments for why public health is bad links to herbicide was done in the 2 and C. They have no frame for impact calculus, which means the link automatically outweighs the A. B, there's a social Darwinism link. The GBN creates a facade of radical change for tobacco addicted minorities, but in reality calcify the relationship between medical institutions and big tobacco that maintains the condition for those kind of addictions in the first place. Their isolation of health disparities measured by healthcare and the idea that criminalizing ads is sufficient to take out tobacco farming is the very criminalization of the love proletariat that we've isolated, i.e. the idea that we can sort of criminalize these sort of corporations, and then the tobacco epidemic that happens in the black community, urban and through herbicide and in urban places, that the AF has said is a link turn is the link argument, because the way in which they have framed that is our whole argument is that there is an distinct trade-off. I said this one of the crossings, our evidence is fantastic, and that the way that drug use has been operationalized in particular has used the ideology of corporations as the starting point rather than the way in which the geography and plantation economy precedes that discourse in the first place. Their analysis necessarily trades off the zero answer to it. Third is saviorism. The AF's liberatory struggle overcomes the underlying geopolitical racial blackness convinces black people to invest in reform by making them feel like they're doing something, while state lash out and gratuitous violence to unproductive black people within the economy to sustain societal progress. For territorialization, this adds the correction of existing spaces, can't separate differences from racial difference in terms of white geographies, rather makes those the dominant grammar for a post-racial world to destroy the tools of salvation. 5, harm reduction. This said they have dropped the 1 and C Smith evidence that says the story of harm reduction to reduce the harms of drug policy through neoliberal health narratives co-opts people's livabilities in illicit economies like the alt's junkie communism, and allows the government to shift in order to infiltrate, proven by elites trying to take over mutual aid networks. But it's especially true of the public health narratives. I don't have to finish the card because it's pretty on point about why state revolutionary tactics in the context of neoliberal health policy is intrinsically co-opted, but which flips the co-option argument on its head. But even then, the state is not inevitable. We'll answer, especially the criminalization to that, because they cannot, the lumpen proletariat will not criminalize themselves, obviously. Rather, they have dropped all of the examples like the young lords using Chicago hospitals and taking it over in order to treat addiction for junkies in the Communist Party. They have no evidence that in the context of us, the true evidence is terrible. It just says the state is taking out anarchist movements in the past. It does not have any evidence about why taking over hospitals is bad, or that does not solve, which means that they have no internal link to this stuff. The thing about how tobacco overcodes it was answered above, because we do not say that tobacco is revolutionary. We just said that it's good for indigenous things like indigenous practices within the alt, but we could use recuperation tactics and taking over hospitals and solve addiction, which solves the harms of the affirmative. The contention one we're going for a couple of internal link takeouts. The first is that they cannot solve tobacco production, i.e. if the lumpen proletariat is already using it or in urban geographies, why the fuck do they need ads in order to continue using? And if the people who are already addicted would introduce it to teens and more people, why are ads key to that? They have zero internal links to this, so you should be very skeptical. The next thing is that how do they solve all plantation or all tobacco plantation farming? They have zero evidence that says it's reverse causal. It just says that it decreases use, not that transnational corporations who already have farming will be taken out. Their only answer is spillover with zero warrant. I don't have to draw a line here because the 2C did not make an argument of why this is true. They have just said asserted and why states would spill over. They have no evidence of transnational corporations would stop just because of customary international law. They have just said that customary international law is binding, but our evidence is comparatively better. It says that things like the EU have circumvented it in the past because they want profit motives, which our thesis of the plantation economy means that the ass impacts are inevitable, i.e. deforestation. So if the racialized and lumpen proletariat is utilized and taken out by big tobacco companies, that makes their impacts inevitable insofar as the tobacco production is used in order to kill black people. That takes out the deforestation impact. It's also from 2012, which means it should have been triggered. Contention 2. Contention is a joke. Why do they solve all of these things like companies? Their answer was also spillover. They do not solve Facebook, big food, big pharma, big oil, which all of their evidence it says is all causes to the app. Also, obviously, you do not solve anything like that. If we win our theory of like racial capitalism and the plantation economy, it obviously takes it out because those corporations will obviously give fake news and shit like Facebook. There's no way that they can solve any of that.
All right, we have 7:07 starting now.
I'm just wondering if you answered like this
Stop prep. 228. I have 2 cards I'll send out. Okay, it should be sent. Sorry, let me just save the document. Then I'll give an order. Okay, cool. The order is going to be the advantages in the order of the tobacco advantage, then the commercial advantage, then the K.
So like for the
Did I send the wrong one
like,
AR doc? Oh god,
Oh
wait.
yeah, sorry. For the advantages, you mean like the I don't know what they're called, but like the first advantage, second advantage,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
I accidentally sent the one AR doc. These politics cards probably do not apply.
I don't think you all care all that much about the SALT caucus in Congress.
I think I sent the right one now. Let me check the preview. Yeah, okay.
I haven't gotten it yet, but I'll tell you when I'm good.
Okay. Oops, sorry.
Cool. I'm good.
Okay,
I'm not ready.
okay.
I still don't have it.
Yeah, I was about to ask, sorry. Just let me know when you're good.
You're good to go.
If anyone's not ready, please stop me now. Smoking is the leading cause of early death among black people. That's the TI evidence. Refocusing policing on ads instead of is key to prevent policing that criminalizes black communities. That's the issue that it wastes they've conceded epistemological biases by corporate media, which means you should cognitively err towards preventing smoking and independently causes deforestation, soil and water damage, etc., which cause extinction. The first argument we can't solve tobacco production. Our argument is not about the current generation of smokers who are already addicted, but rather the next generation of smokers, which are evidence validated by empirical studies, social science studies that indicates that ads are the main pathway for which young people get addicted to smoking via racially targeted ads promoted by corporations. We do not need to solve all tobacco farming. Rather, we've made a predictive claim about minimizing the necessity for tobacco in the future, especially when they've mishandled our global spillover argument. There's two pieces of evidence that the Lang evidence gives two warrants. First is that there's momentum for other countries because they view the U.S. as something they can cite as a reason for why they should also ban ads domestically, and the customary international law maintains legal obligation. Our evidence is much better on the circumvention stuff. The EU did not circumvent in the past. Only our evidence is specific to the TCA's stuff, the commercial advantage. Corporate pseudoscience causes extinction through climate and vaccine denialism and war. That's the counter evidence. Only the AF solves the resolution of conflicting precedents and broader intervention. That's the Pascal and Bakken evidence. We do sell big food and big pharma because the spillover of First Amendment precedent. The Central Hudson test that governs all commercial speech was started with tobacco. Means that since the AF overturns it, it removes commercial speech protection, which is the Pascal and Bakken evidence. We don't need to win. We solve everything. Since the AF provides the conditions for future movements that do solve, which explicitly in the PAT evidence. Go to the K. We read two cards answering their theories of power, and the 2NC still sends up and says we dropped it. We read two specific pieces of evidence answering it, but they also have zero alternatives capable of solving because they do not have an alternative forwards black geographies. Rather, only because they did not read that alternative, but their geography is incomplete. X and the Chewed SoCai evidence. It's also this answers their herbicide and ontology arguments. Not all black people exist in plantation features. More Africans have immigrated to the U.S. in the last 30 years than arrived during the entire slave trade. Centering plantations and slavery demands those immigrants assimilate to black geographies that they don't relate to, which displaces the diasporic geographies as impacted out with 1NC the war 1NC McCurchick evidence. So you should refuse their theory of power and judge instruction about non-black academics, which relies on the same logic they critique. The judge instruction stuff. There are different approaches forwarded by different people. The De Leon evidence, which is our solvency advocate, is a black pansexual and advocates for policy form same, which proves they cannot assert a universal frame, which is isolated in cross-six framework. The role of the ballot is to determine the desirability of the plan's implementation. First, predictability. The 1 to 2 is built around defending the hypothetical consequences. The components we have to defend SAPs, that offensively forcing us debate for the infinite number of orientation toward politics. The impact is fairness debates a game, and the only thing the ballot does is endorse a particular model as desirable. Second is rejoinder. Their links must be causal, and the alternative must solve them, or else it's a non-unique disadvantage. The impact is clash evaluating component consequences of research is the only way to determine whether or not the 1AC is a good idea. If they can't translate abstract theorization into concrete analysis, it proves that they have an internalized literature and can't effectively apply it, which means that internal link turns most of their offense. The benefit is opponent preparation, which is necessary to develop ethical reasoning and empower actors outside the academic bubble. Unpredictability is not good. We've internal linked insofar as we need to apply theory specifically in order to result in epistemic change, which is the Waterstone evidence. They haven't impacted others. They said unpredictability is good because it forces civil society to recognize this. Obviously, clash also accesses that same internal link. The next argument was that it's not an intrinsic good. The Spolnsky explicitly answers the second argument because the Spolnsky says we don't because having debates about it does not mean we internalize those feelings, but rather it gives people the skills necessary to be able to better explain to other people that the change is necessary. Which the next argument was that fairness kills black bodies. So our argument is not about becoming policymakers, but rather about clash broadly. But just because having debates about policy doesn't turn you into policymakers, rather provides you the skills necessary to defend the instances of pragmatic reforms, which are necessarily good, as was beyond before. The next argument is you should weigh the F as intellectual strategy. It means nothing without the consequences of that intellectual strategy. We've read 2 pieces of evidence that indicate the plan necessarily spills up, which means even if we lose framework, that you can still evaluate the 1AC's intellectual strategy as good because it spills up to materially solve smoking, which is the piece of Waterstone evidence. The AF choice does not solve because there's an infinite number of orientation, but isolated in the overview. They do not spill up outside of the debate space either, only where we can convince other people differently, as per the Slonsky evidence that can change races to convince races to change their mind. They should have read the black geographies all if they want to make it a question of tactics. We did answer it though, which was all done above. Though I'm not going for utilitarianism because the perm is definitely the only way to solve the impacts of the alt. Permutation do both. It's sufficient to solve most of the links, especially when the alt is material. They can't claim disadvantages about research methodologies, but I'll do the link debate here. The first link, our argument was not people are bad because they get addicted to drugs, but rather that we should prevent people from getting addicted to life-threatening drugs in the first place. It's not that it devalues them as people, but rather it's something that is preventable, and we should minimize those forms of suffering. The next argument, the Darwinian link, is a link of omission that we did not go far enough, which explicitly challenged the ideology of corporations and the current systems that exist now, and open it up for capitalist movements, which is the second advantage. The saviorism link is solved by the permutation, but there's no link because we just identified causal harms that apply to everyone, including black people. Our framing is good to prevent causal violence. The territorialism, dissent, and mutual aid dissent are explicitly answered because they're both links of omission. But we did explicitly said not to police people, rather to police corporations. So the next argument was spectacularization. We do not spectacularize violence. Only if identified that violence exists with data. The Tracy evidence indicates that's good because materiality can be good at preventing violence. The alt definitely fails. First, criminalization. Dissent criminalization is why worker solidarity is failing because of drug addiction, and tobacco co-opts those movements as radical movements because it means to exploit their social language. It means to promote tobacco usage, which inevitably turns the alt.
Okay, 6:25.
Okay. The order is going to be the K and then case. I'll be doing some top level stuff, but then the very next thing I do after the top level stuff is the ult. Is anybody not ready? Cool. The 1AR messes up a lot when they spend a lot of time on framework. We're conceding framework. This is irrelevant because the question of this debate is the question of materiality and the alternative. No ink on all the alternative solves you have and the links, which means that if I can isolate a unique link in the way in which the alternative functions, they have already lost this debate. Now it's a question of impact framing. Even if the util stuff doesn't apply, cross-apply the herbicide stuff here. They didn't have an answer to it explicitly. We've critiqued the notion that they can devaluate certain black population, the spectralization of the things like allowing for black people to be determined as dead and dying is a critique that we forwarded in the first place. They've determined that people who are already addicted to smoking are already dead and dying and not worth saving, but people of future generations are always infinitely valuable. We've critiqued that notion and said that the alternative can solve for both by by taking over the hospitals and healthcare agencies to provide material incentives for those solutions in the first place. They only have two answers to this. The first is the criminalization stuff. No reason why the lumpen proletariat will criminalize themselves, which means that black people already have the means of access to those in the first place. Second, this criminalization doesn't happen because it's a focus of the people who are at the bottom in the first place. No reason why it would get left that way. The co-option argument first, it stops addiction writ large because it gives examples like the young lords of the BPP who took controls of hospitals, allowed for people to sort of change their relationship to addiction in the first place. We've said that the way in which addiction operates is through social contingents, and the way in which tobacco is influenced by communities, which is only changed through the alternative. Second is there's no internal link between the ads and the tobacco writ large and movements, the fracturing it, which means that only the alternative, which has a not contested state of the way in which we operationalize that internal link is unsolved, means that's just a question of the link. The link I'm going here for is the sort of public health link. They severely mishandled it in the what are. The only answer is that it says that people are bad, but we've considered it has the same sort of argument as the impact framing argument in that their devaluation of certain black people is what we've criticized. The notion that certain people who are addicted are valueless and shouldn't be provided any material incentives is what the healthcare, what the discourse of health uses in and of itself to criminalize the majority. This is not a discourse link, but as a consequence of a plan, because they've isolated that people who are addicted now already get excluded. There's only one metric to weigh this, which is the herbicide framing, which means that you can't give it to them. Let me do a quick thing on the app itself. They've dropped the card that I read under materiality. They didn't even say durable fiat, which means that they don't get any access to this as a new argument. It says that if black people support the plan, it'll immediately get circumvented. No sort of argument about durable fiat means that you can't give them this argument coming into the 2AR. Means that the policy won't pass in the first place, means that only the alternative has the radical capabilities that they've isolated. The permutation, I'll do it here. They've dropped that there's no permutation because it legitimizes the way in which the state functions by reasserting it within the hierarchies of the state in and of itself. Means that it inevitably will get co-opted by the state. The state will say that we can do things better and to do stuff overwhelmingly that hurts black people. Territorialization, it says that the very racialized geographies that they use get co-opted by the inclusion of the statist discourse, because it says that the state will do stuff for racial geographies, but inevitably fractures the resistance by creating internal divides within the community. They've dropped all of the harm reduction dissad. This should be a GG here because there's not even a single answer here. It says neoliberal co-option happens because the state uses the legitimacy that they're provided to kill black people in the status quo post-plan, which means that the infiltration of these movements of mutual aid, etc., are all ensured. It recreates the stuff that happens to that happened to the BPP, which means that only we have an internal link to a radical process that they can't adjust for. The sort of the plantation future stuff, even if they have access to the black geography stuff, it's not important here because it's a question of material solvency writ large. So if we've isolated that we solve for more that they don't get to weigh it, remember they can weigh the plan, but it's a question of the impact framework that we've isolated pre-round to the way in which you evaluate the sort of plan in the first place. Centering the lumpen proletariat could be the only frame of analysis that you can adopt because it's the only frame that allows us to have access to these health networks in the first place. I'll answer the specific way that we solve the app here. It allows for community formations through mutual aid that says that people who are advertised to don't get addicted because they have the ability to sort of confront addiction in the first place and avoid the sort of expenditure of ads in the tobacco system by talking with their community members. The case. Advantage one, they don't solve transnational tobacco. Even if some countries ban it, they have tons of resources internationally and continue deforestation. Even if the past smokers still influence kids and they don't brand production overall, no spillover war. It means that you don't give it to them. There's remember Crossix, but they couldn't isolate even one country, which means that there's no modeling claim. Advantage two, they don't stop climate denialism like anti-vaxxers and Facebook giving extra data, which means at worst they don't solve for the big pharma and other companies co-opting the app, but the alternative can solve it through mutual aid networks.
All right, we have 228. Starting, Tony, are you good? Okay, starting now. Advantage 1, advantage 2. Okay. All right, can I get a thumbs up or verbal confirmation when people are good?
I'm ready.
Good when you are.
Cool. Smoking at waste is the leading cause of death among marginalized communities. That's the TI evidence. It's the biggest impact on this around the TI evidence. It says that advertisements are directed at marginalized communities, including Black people, which causes them to smoke more than other groups because they're marginalized in the first place. Tobacco companies see them as an easy target, which causes net more harm in the first place. Now they're answering their arguments. We do so. If they didn't answer the predictive argument that we've been making throughout this entire round, people looked to the U.S. for guidance on tobacco regulations. They see the Tobacco Control Act, which is what the F fully enacts as not being fully realized. But if it was realized, they would look to the U.S. and say, "Oh, look, the U.S. did it now, so we're now allowed to." They've read zero evidence. They have extended zero evidence on this question. We've pushed forward our evidence of the whole thing that. The past smokers influence thing. The app itself does not necessarily claim to solve for past smokers, but the perm can solve, which I'll get to. Later. But past smokers did influence it. We've read evidence that ads are the largest approximate cause because they are what makes smoking look cool. Obviously, just one person telling you, "Hey, it's cool." If you're not seeing it as a larger media push on this thing being cool in the mainstream, would not access it. The commercial speech advantage. We solve corporate speech. Central Hudson test regulates all of commercial speech, but it was based on tobacco regulations, which means that through doing the F, we overturned the Central Hudson test, which removes all protections for commercial speech. We also solve it through follow-on and spillover. The piety evidence says that movements to counter commercial speech and to counter tobacco need to first get rid of this commercial speech protections, what they've never dealt with. So we do access a full weight of this advantage, but it also always corporate speech infiltrates all of their hospitals. It warps science, so people don't see tobacco or other things as a threat in the first place, which means that all of their hospitals don't actually solve anything with if commercial speech is warped because corporations are able to turn everything to only gain profit for them. Now go to the K page proper. I'll do the perm at the top. The perm definitely solves the links and avoids the criminalization dissent to the alt. First is our offense. First is the criminalization dissent. The O'Brien alt card. Their alt card says that the reason that the movements they endorse do not exist in the status quo is that because the state is criminalizing people who are addicted to drugs. Their only answer to this was obviously the movements wouldn't criminalize themselves, which was never our argument. Our argument was that other outside forces criminalize them and destroy the movements from the inside, which means that the AFSA shift of policing corporations instead of policing people is key to alt solvency because that's the only way we're able to actually change that dichotomy and allow those movements to be successful in the first place, which you can also get from the piety corporate speech evidence. Yes, the alts. The second net benefit to the perm is the corporate speech thing that I explained on the advantage. But like I said, all of their hospitals are useless without regulations or protections from commercial speech because corporations will just abuse it. That's a De Leon and Bacon evidence. Now the link debate there is one of them, and it's a link of omission. We explicitly critique the frame to devalue certain people in the 1IC by saying we should police corporations for doing bad things and using racially targeted advertising instead of criminalizing people for making the mistake of starting to smoke in their teens. Our argument was never to ignore those people, but rather you can mitigate preventable suffering via stopping tobacco addiction, and that is good. The link argument boils down to you did address people now, which is a link of omission that the permutation can definitely solve because it would address people who are already addicted to things like cigarettes through those hospital things, but would also prevent new people from starting smoking by preventing ads and those other things. The durable fiat thing, we do get durable fiat. It was not explained as a solvency argument. This was only explained to answer spill up, not to answer solvency, which means we do get answers to it because our explanation of it changes. Obviously, the plan gets durable fiat, but I don't necessarily know why this is relevant in the first place because they haven't read any piece of evidence that Black people specifically would advocate for the plan, which means even if Black people like it, they wouldn't necessarily advocate it for it, which means it wouldn't change the implementation of it in Congress. Now, anything else, Tony? I think that's pretty much it. Oh, right. The harm reduction the new loophole option thing, the permutation definitely solves this because it gets rid of all the regulations on commercial speech, but it also creates this sort of separate communities which would be out from under the reach of the state if they're right that the state can easily co-opt things using their legitimacy. The state will obviously just use that legitimacy that they have in the first place to co-opt all of their movements, and only regulating commercial speech and preventing and increasing policing of ads is able to actually solve for this system. But the perm definitely solves it because the state doesn't have legitimacy because it's doing autonomous groups, but only the perm can solve the criminalization just said and the tobacco corporate speech thing.
Good debate, y'all.
Good debate.
Good debate.
Do you want a card doc?
Sure.
Got you.
The neg card doc is sent.
The ask card doc is sent. Okay, the decision is in. Okay,
I'm here.
cool. Anyone in particular have a preference to announce?
You can go for it.
Okay, cool. Well, congratulations on both teams for making it to the octafinals of the Tournament of Championships, singular championship. It is a real accomplishment to be here, to be at this round, and it's been a privilege to judge the round. Awesome debate. The decision was a 3-0 for the affirmative from GBN. Okay, so I can go first. I guess neither of y'all have been judged by me before, but TLDR, I always send out the written text of my RFD because something about it being good for education, something about judge accountability for myself. So feel free to follow along. I'm going to mostly read straight down. It should be in your inbox in just a second. So I start my decision making by evaluating whether or not there's a disad to the permutation that outweighs the net benefits to the permutation. I view the no perm argument in the 2NR as material and not theoretical, so I don't have to consider rejecting the permutation outright. So I'll start by isolating that of each. The net benefits to the permutation, I see them as the two advantages to the AF, the first being spun as the criminalization disad, and the second being explicitly flagged as commercial speech. I'm kind of confused as to why the environment impact didn't make it into the 2AR, just because there was little to no pushback, but whatever. The disads to the permutation. First is what I'll call the negon presumption argument behind the argument that the AF doesn't affect tobacco use writ large, either because of ads being the wrong internal link or because the plan gets rolled back. Two, the spectacularization / public health link, both of which I see as having the impact of devaluation of particular Black people. Third is territorialization, which is the splits movements thing. And fourth is the harm reduction disad. I think there are several issues I see with these disads to the permutation. They fall into two broad camps, namely that A, these disads are not put in context of the world of the permutation, aka where the alt may be able to solve and B, the 2NR does not explain the uniqueness of these disads considering the permutation as well. The 2AR more so highlights A than B, though I think aspects of both are there, but I wish the 2AR had used more of the language from framework earlier in the round to make this a uniqueness issue. I think that would have made this much cleaner. Namely, if the framing issue of the round for the 2NR is material impacts, then I'm not sure why advocating the permutation does not address most of the problems of point number 2, aka future generations and current people get some mode of response to tobacco use through either the plan or the alternative. What this 2NR really needed was time spent sitting on this link to explain why the world of the permutation would still be net worse than the world of the alternative alone, given how the inclusion of the plan may perhaps take over a public narrative or increase the strength of a problematic public health regime. But I think instead, all I get is this sort of nebulous claim that the way that they're extrapolating the public health regime as is ignores current populations of people who are targeted by tobacco companies and are thus subject to public health disparities as a result, which doesn't get to the sort of more offensive level framing about what the inclusion of the plan does in the world of the permutation. With regards to the harm reduction disad, I think that the 2AR spin is just better. I don't know why co-option is unique if the state is already in power, and there's an unresolved question of the threshold of the link in order for it to outweigh. On point number 1, I don't think that either of these arguments gets enough time in the 2NR for me to vote on it, namely the negon presumption stuff. I don't think that the 2NR is very good about explaining why ads do not have a strong threshold for the link, do not have a strong influence on tobacco usage at all. And at best, you might win that it has little influence on current populations, but that circles back to the perm analysis from above. With regards to the durable fiat rollback argument, I think that this argument in the 2NR gives you some defense, but it's too generic of a warrant for me to conclude that the entirety of the app becomes completely nullified. And I think that the 2AR analysis is sufficient for me to at least weigh, some of the affirmative. Lastly, with regards to the territorialization argument, I just don't think that this is much of the 2NR at all, and the net benefits of the permutation probably outweigh. Namely, I think that if you're going to make an argument about how the affirmative would divide movements, I want to know what the movement looks like in the world of the permutation then? Does it just mean that it doesn't exist at all? That seems like a threshold that is probably not one that I would just assume sans much more analysis there. So I think that ultimately the plan is able to address issues of tobacco use among ad-targeted communities, if not currently, then at least in the future. And even though I'm skeptical of the commercial speech advantage, the negative never responds to the argument that the central Hudson test is based on tobacco. So I think that there is at least some risk that the plan is also good for movements. I think that it was a mistake in this round to not go for a framework. I think the 1 hour was set up a pretty decent outline of the public health link, which I can speak more to here, but that would have been a pretty great argument to pair with a framework argument about epistemology and a need to question the frames through which we advocate particular humanitarian paradigms, e.g. public health being operationalized as a way to individualize health disparity violence instead of addressing the broader issue of segregation, systemic racism and anti-Blackness, isolated poverty. This is actually a very core part of the public health literature that, like, question mark whether or not you're actually familiar with this based on the cards that you've read, but it tags onto a very core part of the literature base that is highlighting how public health regimes, especially throughout the 20th century, as they moved into, like, particularly South America, from United States humanitarian efforts, have attempted to isolate, like, doing things for public health as a way of, like, not having to redress the wealth inequality between the two different sides of the continent. And that is a core part of the way that people discuss public health. The focal point of public health as an issue is necessarily embedded in the attempt to obfuscate these poverty regimes that actually cause the underlying effects. And I thought that that was really there earlier in the debate and sort of got watered down into the more like you ignore current populations of Black people, which feels like a really reductionist version of the argument. I won't read the actual last paragraph, but for the AF, I think that you should just defend the public health regime. I think that, like, your AF is set up well to do this. Like, public health and empirics cannot possibly always be bad. I think that your AF is especially well set up to do this insofar as you not only target ads instead of individuals, but you target corporations, which makes you have a sort of like anti-cap tinge that addresses some of the sort of like poverty angle stuff that I mentioned just now. And then there's more comments I wrote during the round that are pretty lengthy. I'll skip those, but great debate, y'all.
I guess I can go next. I don't disagree with much of what was said. For me, I think the lack of impact calculus and impact comparison in this debate made it kind of frustrating. Additionally, at times, I thought during the rebuttals, it felt like y'all were just extending y'all's stuff and not really addressing the specifics of their advantages. I'll go through them here. First advantage. Oh, by the way, I also did this similar thing as Larry. I emailed out an entire script, and I'm just going to read it straight down. First advantage, I give the AF part solvency for the tobacco control page. I agree with the next characterization about spillover. I'm not sure, based on the AF's explanation in the 2AR, how the AF accesses the extinction/modeling stuff. However, I don't think that the neg has a real substantive solvency takeout to the future Black children smoking stuff. So although I don't grant the AF their extinction scenario on advantage 1, I do think that they have access to their systemic violence impact. Second advantage, this is where I think the neg falters for me. The only argument I have on this page from the negative is that the AF doesn't solve big pharma and that the alt solves through some mutual aid network. However, I don't have a warrant for the argument that the AF doesn't solve big pharma. I think that the AF solves this advantage by policing corporations. Again, I don't think there's a real extinction debate hashed out by the affirmative, so I don't think it grants them extinction. However, I think that they do win on this sheet of paper that corporations will co-opt and circumvent movements, which I think problematizes a lot of the critique debate. And I think the AF is key to stop that kind of corporate co-option. Critique debate proper. Alt debate. I also obviously agree with Larry. I think that conceding framework was a mistake. More of that will be below. Alt debate, I think that the alt debate is strong by the negative. I think that the neg definitely does good things for Black people through junkie communism. However, I think that the examples you provide about and the young lords you provide are pretty good. However, I don't think you have an articulation. However, I think that the lack of articulation by the neg of how your alternative overcomes corporate co-option hurts you in the long run. I think you probably solve a lot of their first advantage, but I don't think you solve the second advantage based off of the stuff I said above. I think that there's a risk that corporate co-option will mitigate alt solvency. Perm/link debate, I think the AF gets the permutation. The negative primarily has 3 arguments against the perm. First is this like links prove mutual exclusivity stuff. I would agree with you if your link was not the AF leaves out people. But I think that the link is strong if I evaluate the debate as the alternative versus the AF. But if you think about the debate through the lens of the alt versus the perm, I think the perm very likely overcomes most of, if not all of, the link. You have this other stuff about Black people supporting or not supporting the plan. I don't think any of this stuff is warranted or impacted out in a meaningful way that could sway my ballot either way. Your second argument about why they don't get a permutation, I don't think you warrant this out well enough for me to disregard their permutation theoretically. And I think that conceding framework means this argument becomes absolutely defunct because their framework interpretation says that the negative has the burden of rejoinder. And if you do not provide the burden of the permutations attest that you have met your burden of rejoinder, thus I think based off of the framework debate, this permutation, they don't get a perm argument goes away. Your third argument about harm reduction, I actually think helps the affirmative. I feel like this argument is basically their second advantage, right? Their entire argument is that neoliberal corporations will co-opt movements and that the AF is the only way to solve that because they're the only ones who can put a legislative check on corporations, which means I think your perm dissat is actually a net benefit to the permutation and thus puts the perm debate significantly behind for y'all. Thus, at the end of the debate, I think that the permutation resolves most of the links and the risk of a risk of the alt not being able to solve corporate co-option outweighs the risk of the links turning the AF or the perm and the alt solving better. I will also note, I felt like cross-ex where y'all were talking, like the whole cross-ex that was about which Black people we should and should not listen to, I thought was extremely uncomfortable and would be something that I would like to avoid in the future.
I wouldn't disagree with much of what was said. I do want to say again, congratulations to both of you for getting to this position. Monday at the TOC is a really impressive achievement, and I think all four of you should be proud of that. And I think, I do want to say that every time that I've judged either team over the course of the season has always been very enjoyable to me. So just wanted to add that. I voted pretty similarly. I voted AF on the permutation. It's the best strategy because it solves for the link and has better inroads to challenging co-option by restricting corporate speech, which the alternative alone doesn't solve for. I don't think that it's necessarily a mistake to go to kick framework, but I think it was a mistake to kick it if you're going to go for this link specifically because it isn't kind of like accounting the pretty easy spin that they can have with the permutation to actually address the link. I think there's a couple of starting points both in the 2 and C and in the 1NR where you kind of like frame their very focal starting point of corporations as being kind of like problematic and it like not actually kind of like understanding, the thesis of herbicide and all of these other issues, and that like that isn't the right starting point that will always like lend itself to like a different form of co-option. And I think that's where you can particularize more offense against the second advantage, as well as, this criminalization argument, which I also think the 2NR kind of isn't really answering. So the permutation, it's really a question of co-option of whether or not it's the state versus kind of like corporations. And I don't really get an explicit comparative analysis in either of the final rebuttals as to which is more insidious. But the 2AR is doing more work on this question and has kind of like the added leeway of the second advantage, which you haven't really had that much defense to or a specific link to as much. And so I think it's easier for them to gain the offense on this as to why, state might be inevitable. There's like going to be more co-option on that question, but we are the only ones who actually have kind of like a material response to this issue. And your alt evidence has outlined criminalization as a problem to solvency, as a barrier to solvency. We're the only ones who can actually kind of like actually tackle that barrier. You just kind of like allow criminalization to still run rampant. And like, even if you can like take over hospitals and do like all of these things that the alternative outlines, there's still kind of the risk of the state and its like carceral components engaging the people who the people who would be functioning under the alternative. So if the 2NR was more predictive of this spin with the second advantage and this criminalization stuff, which I do think like is misanswered in both the block and the 2NR. I think you maybe were not understanding this argument or were dismissing it a little bit. I think if there had been more effective defense on that question, if you were going for a link that can't be resolved so explicitly by the permutation, when it is like this very simple inclusion exclusion link, the permutation like easily has inroads to resolve that. I think there was like good setup in the block for, you had like a diverse array of links. If you had picked one that does have that offense, it's still feasible to kick framework. And I think, it was like a fine decision given like the time trade-off that you had to account for. So I'm not going to kind of like penalize that decision, but it just had to be paired with a link that would like actually be effective against a permutation, and then having kind of like the comparative analysis against the corporate speech advantage. I think if there had been maybe even more time on case on the second advantage to just get rid of the internal link, I also think that would have been a viable option. And I think for the 2AR, definitely there has to be kind of like more impact work that's done. I don't think necessarily like the environment stuff, but if you're going to be deploying the second advantage, really kind of like particularize what those impacts are and explain how they interact with the alternative a little bit better, of like this kind of like movements, et cetera, and all these other things. So I think there's just a couple of areas in the 2NR and the 2AR that kind of failed to capitalize on the position that you had. And yeah, I guess like the only other thing, I'm not entirely sure this was addressed by the two other RFDs, but this like argument about kind of like black endorsement of the affirmative kind of like prevents it passing, was not something that I like really evaluated, because like they get to say fiat, it's true that it's about like advocacy, not endorsement. It's kind of like not a very technical card for this kind of level of concession, but it is a little bit weird because there is this push by the AF that like your solvency author is black, and so that there was like a weird attempt at a technical concession in the 2AR where you're like, oh, well, you didn't read any evidence that says that there is like support for the affirmative in Black communities, which one perceptively isn't a great thing if like you're sort of being like, well, maybe Black communities don't like the AF. And then two, it just felt like a contradiction because you very explicitly were pushing for recognition that one of your authors, your main solvency author is Black. And so I think it was just like, yeah, this is probably like initially framed as an internal link takeout. And so I am willing to grant like the 2AR this like answering of just like, we do just get to fiat the affirmative. But I think the way you answered it was a little bit bizarre. And so that would just be kind of like my last point of feedback. But yeah, great round. And again, congrats all four of you.
I guess I do have a couple of questions. The first part I would want to start on was like this last thing that was part of your decision, Maggie, but I guess it's to all the judges. Is there a way that I could have made the argument that would have been more offensive, or do you think this argument is just generally unpersuasive? I just thought that because they dropped it, it would implicate AF solvency regardless.
I think I don't know how you overcome the fiat question.
That's what I was saying, though. I felt like in the 2NR, I was like trying to predict it by saying the 1AR doesn't even say a durable, doesn't answer the card at all. It doesn't make a durable fiat claim. It shouldn't be able to be re-articulated in the 2AR.
I think go ahead. No, go ahead.
So the way that I kind of like perceive these arguments is that if on a technical level, they could like be answered even in like the last speech by that to be technically true, even if you're preempting that, I don't really know how to resolve the fact that they can just get up and say durable fiat, kind of like resolve this. If they have extended the affirmative and defending it being passed that way, it's just kind of like even if it's not an explicit argument in the 1AR, it's like an implicit argument of the way that they've actually extended the affirmative. And so unless you're explaining how it's a actual solvency issue takeout instead of like implicating durable fiat, it's like a little bit weird, especially since, again, even if it's like a technically conceded argument, this card is bad. It's like super, super vague, and I don't know exactly what it's saying. So it's not kind of like this like TKO, the way that you're presenting it of just like, oh, they could kind of like conceded this complete like solvency takeout. It's like a weird argument that doesn't really function within the technical parameters of how we assume AFs to exist in debate. And so even if you're like preempting that take by the 2AR still gets to have that take. Does that make sense?
Okay, it just sounded like it was just a generally like unpersuasive argument. So I guess that does make sense.
Yeah.
I think in general, fiat, any circumvention argument that can be resolved by durable fiat or resolved by the words durable fiat, right? I feel like are relatively unpersuasive to a lot of judges.
Okay. The
like
link debate,
any type of like rollback argument, etc. Right?
That makes sense. The link debate, what do you think would have been the better link to go for in this round?
I think like doubling down on the herbicide stuff. And so there is like good factual and rhetorical explanation in the 2NR and in the block. But in the 2NR, it's like there is good rhetorical explanation for this link. I think if that explanation had been couched under the herbicide offense and explained as you are focusing on corporations and like the perm pivot that you're doing is still kind of like focusing on this idea of corporate speech, which still misunderstands and misdiagnoses like all of these issues, which is what all of what the like McKittrick evidence is talking about, then the permutation still has a trade-off and still has kind of like still triggers the unique links that you're going for when you're couching the issue of like not understanding the I guess parameters of public health and how they affect marginalized bodies, understanding them within this broader context, because they're focusing on like, oh, the targeting of like marginalized communities. And then I think there's also kind of like more space for you to be talking about like the permutation is still going to be seeing people as like dead and dying. And so the perm debate was, I think, a little bit too separated from the link debate, where you're like doing the like harm reduction offense, and then you have kind of like the link being a little bit more separate. But you have to be painting me a picture of this is what the world of the permutation actually looks like. This is how they're going to spin it. This is why that's wrong. And that's the link debate.
That stuff makes sense. The alternative writ large, I felt like there was a bit of difference in how each judge evaluated it. To what extent do you think that the takeouts to the alternative could have been answered better, or there were certain arguments that you highlighted as more like it just initially just takes out the alternative?
So I saw when GBN read this 1AC, I knew that the 2AR was going to be corporations co-opt, like that was going to be their offensive strategy, right? Because K teams are the most prepped for usually the state debate, right? The state good bad question. GBN knew that, so they pivoted to the corporate stuff to avoid that robust level of the debate. Where I think at least for me, I think you need to explain how your young lords and your BPP access or resolve the questions of corporate co-option, right? Like, I think you need to have at some point explicitly say in the 2NR, like, here's how the young lords and here's how BPP could do X, Y, or Z in regards to corporate co-option, right?
I also think that, like, especially given that this is like pseudo a cap vault, you probably should have just made more use of that. Like, it's bad to play into like targeting corporate ads as a way of like being anti-corporate. That's like a really lukewarm take compared to like rallying the power of the lumpen proletariat. And so I think that I'm not sure that would have resolved itself at the material level, but if there was the framework push still, then definitely is like a good path, and given the situation still would have been better than the just like what Gershom said.
Not for sure.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. There's like definitely ways to present this as like more a broader like mutual aid based alternative, which I think like could have more effective ways to like resolving the second advantage. But I do think it was explained very well. Maybe the problem is that it solves like the first advantage a little too well, because then it's like solving for current people, and then you're saying, well, it's a problem that the AF doesn't, and so then the permutation easily accesses that a form of solvency. But I think it was like explained very well, these examples that are given, and it's like, I think I appreciate the very nuanced and specific nature of this critique against this AF, but I do think there could have been, like Larry just said, deploying the mutual aid stuff. And I think there's also kind of like, what does messaging actually look like with regards to, there's the offense that they've actually articulated in the 1AR against this is like kind of like bizarro. It's, oh, there's still going to be like misinformation like in hospitals. It's like, no, you're taking over the hospitals. Like, how does that make any sense? So maybe pushing back. And I think this is where the 2NR can like maybe hold the line a little bit better, instead of wasting time on this fiat, this solvency takeout with the durable fiat thing. I think holding the line more of just like, yeah, sure, maybe they have like the corporate speech offense, but they've like completely failed to articulate where exactly that takes out the alternative, and tell us to hold the line a little bit better and on that question, because I think then you let the 2AR, by not answering that explicitly and then not also being like, this wasn't articulated super clearly in the 1AR as to what impacts you're actually accessing and what the alternative like actually can't resolve with corporate speech, it lets the 2AR get away with a lot more spin.
I was a little bit confused on the stuff about the second advantage, I guess, made more sense to me. I was just confused on how we could resolve that, whether that was just the case debating or also the alternative debating. So I'm just trying to get a grasp of what might be possible in the next time that we have any of y'all in the back.
I think the alt debating is more just accounting for the way they're leveraging the second advantage. And so it's being able to explain why the harm reduction state stuff actually outweighs more than like corporate influence, and then having some more defense on the second advantage. So making the time for that in the 2NR on the case page, and then just like reorganizing how you're tackling the alt debate with regards to second advantage.
A little separately from that, though I don't disagree, I think that would also be helpful. I think that this debate feels weird because it feels like you went for racial cap where the first half was racial and the second half was cap. And that made the sort of like distinction of what theory of power you're extending in this round kind of weird. Not that is to say though that I don't think the 2NR had much of a push on a theory of power that it was extended, because I think that the 2NC was extending more of the like racial side than the cap side, though they're not supposed to be distinct. But the point being, I think that extending the consolidating the two into a coherent theory of power, I think would do you a lot in terms of using that to re-articulate what the case debate looks like. So RE, the earlier part when we were talking about like whether or not it makes sense to say that like targeting corporate speech or ads is actually a way of like hedging back against corporate co-option, like how does that actually stop the power of corporations from like the tobacco lobby or something like that, right? And so using that theory of power to sort of re-articulate where to have terminal defense then against any sort of like they stop corporate co-option or like they allow for more movements against corporation stuff, I think would go a long way in terms of like establishing both defense against the case and also but defense meaning a re-articulation based on your rereading of the affirmative through your theory, the lens of your theory of power, and then also bolstering the impact of the link debate.
Okay. Christian, did you have anything?
I just had a quick question. So, given that every judge said not exactly the same, but similar things about this like framework / link portion because the link did not overcome the permutation. Did you think there should have been some other link in the 1NR? Did you think that the link explanation should have been more material? Do you think, or just that like there was nothing that could have been done and just straight up go for framework in the link?
I think, for me at least, I think you needed a more like specific and material discussion of the way the AF works and the way your link would function with that and how your alt overcomes that. A lot of the negative for me was a little too theoretical at times. And I think getting down to the more specifics, especially in terms of the scenario, and this is what I said at the start of my RFD, right, about like the impact calculus, right? Like impacting out your links, I think could take you a long way.
Just like saying again what I said earlier, it's fine to not go for framework. I think there obviously was a way where like going for framework could have like aided you, but if you're not going to go for framework, which I think is a fine strategic choice, and like when a 2NR makes a bold choice like that, it had to be couched in I think the best offense that I would have preferred to see was some of the 1NR arguments about the like starting point of like addressing corporations being bad and how that doesn't address the thesis of the critique with the like herbicide stuff. I think that would have been the link to go for, because then you do gain offense on the permutation because it's still focusing on corporations.
Okay, that makes sense.
Just to be clear, Maggie. Oh, sorry, Larry.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, sorry, my bad. I was just gonna ask Maggie, but the second thing of like the 1NR thing, did you mean just like the second link, or like I'm just like unclear what you meant?
Yes, I think it was the second link. There was also like some arguments about it in the 2NC as well, but it was kind of just like a better, I guess, heuristic to have in the 2NR than like you're just not focusing on the right people at the right time.
I agree with what Maggie said insofar as I just want to like shout out like bold choice not to go for a framework is like not a problem, at least for me personally. And I think that going for strategies that are much more material is like a good look. But I think that if you're asking this question in the context of like next year's topic per se, these debates I've noticed have just been much harder on this year's topic insofar as people are reading AFs that are like relatively true, at least to some degree. This is like probably one of the ones sort of in the middle compared with like stuff like death penalty and like mandatory minimums and whatnot. But it still holds like a pretty decent degree of like truth levelness to it insofar as it's like, well, tobacco ads are bad. And so in these instances, I feel like it's much more difficult to be going for a case strategy without framework because it forces you into a sort of much weirder position where you would have to defend a world where X action didn't happen, period, as opposed to like X action having like some negative consequences. But like, you know, it should still be done at the end of the day, which is the like sort of way that one would frame the permutation or just F outweighs the all. I think that on next year's topic, going for material strategy will just frankly be much easier. And perhaps we'll play to your strengths if this is what you like to do, because next year's topic, God knows, is going to be so much less just like true F-ish. People will be reading like absolutely ridiculous stuff.
Speaking of which, actually, are y'all both juniors?
Yeah.
Okay. I also do want to say, since the other two said it, but I didn't say it, I've judged you both, I think, 3 times now. I enjoy judging you a lot, and if, I end up judging you next year, I look forward to it. I think like I voted for y'all in prelims. I think y'all are very good debaters. I just think cleaning up some things here and there will help you all a lot.
For sure. Before we go, I think that everyone pretty much has their questions answered. I was going to just reiterate that. Appreciate you, Gershom and Maggie, for judging us in prelims. Unfortunately, Larry didn't get to see us in prelims. It's okay. See you later next year. Thank you all for judging. Thank you all for waking up this morning. We appreciate it a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks for a good round, y'all.
Yep.
Good luck next year.